Hin. Great. So we are moving on to one exciting session to the other. I think this session is going to give us a flavor of what we can learn in America. There are many international folks who have joined here, so we'll get to learn from a comparative perspective. And we have two amazing speakers here who are available and discussing their paper. Nancy, I think, Nancy, I can't see you here.
Hi, Radhika, I'm here.
Hi, Nancy. Thanks for joining. And Yaa, I think Yaa is also here. Fantastic. Great. So we have both Yaa and Nancy. And I just want to, in the chat, send this link to this paper, which they have recently written with other colleagues. And I think it's a nice reflective paper to discuss environmental education in the school context. It discusses representation of humans, climate change, and environmental degradation in school textbooks in Ghana and Malawi. And here is the link to the paper. And before we get into that, I'll just go over some of the bios. It's again very short bios. We will not be able to do full justice to their stellar work, but I just wanted to mention a few things. Nancy Kendall is a professor of education policy studies. Her research examines the consequences of national and international policies and funding streams directed at improving the lives and well-being of children, communities, states positioned at marginalized by national and international regimes. So looking at the decolonial literature that Iveta Silova was discussing earlier on, but now in the very specific sub-Saharan African context, as well as other countries. So her research projects have examined education for all, political democratization and educational governance, structural adjustments and education, US higher education, sexuality, HIV education, gender, and schooling. That's a lot of breadth of work that she's covering in the context of Malawi, Mozambique, US, Colombia, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Zimbabwe, and in many other places, especially now we'll be discussing Malawi and Ghana in this context. And she's worked with a variety of foundations, including Fulbright Foundation, Social Science Research Council, TAG, Philanthropic Foundation, many other foundations who have been able to get her insights and shape their work. Nancy is the author of the Sex Education Debate, University of Chicago Press, and has published many peer-reviewed journals in my field, comparative international education, in the best fields, in the best papers in the field. So we are very lucky to have Nancy here. She's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thanks, Nancy, for joining. And we also have Yaa Ampofo. She's a doctoral student in the Department of Educational Policy Studies in University of Wisconsin-Madison, and also with a concentration in comparative and international education. Her research interest lies at an intersection of education, decolonization, environmental studies, and sustainable development courses. So really the intersection that we really are looking at, and as we've seen in all those sessions in the morning, I think this intersectionality is really has come through. So we'll get an insight from these two scholars in the field. And Yaa is also particularly interested in thinking through within alternatives and subaltern ecological frameworks of planetary health, as well as this intersection of environment as we proceed. So, and again, her work is also in Ghana, across indigenous spaces, across different Western scientific discursive spaces. Her work also seeks to address how these different frameworks are conceptualized, human environment interdependencies and social environmental changes, and are all coming together. So I think this will be a fascinating discussion to have with both of you. To discuss maybe in 10 or 15 minutes the paper, and then maybe we can take some questions from the audience. And I have a few questions in mind as well.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate being here with all of you and this opportunity to talk about this work. I'm going to try to share screen and probably screw up the first time, so stick with me. Apologies.
Okay.
All right, I hope you can all see that. And now we will put it into slideshow. Great. I apologize, I'm going to turn off my video. Yaa may need to as well. We're in places where the internet doesn't always support video and audio. So thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you today. And thank you so much to the organizers of this fantastic conference, and particularly to Dr. Iyengar, our discussant, for the opportunity to share this article with you. My name is Nancy Kendall.
And I'm Yaa Ampofo. Wonderful to meet you all.
As you know, Sub-Saharan Africa faces some of the most extreme impacts. Sorry, folks, let me try to make this, there we go. Some of the most extreme impacts of global climate and environmental change, and youth are extremely vulnerable to the consequences of these changes. The international community has argued that formal schooling must play a central role in educating for mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development. But critical development and education scholars have argued that schooling can't play such a role because of its dominionist and colonialist roots, policies, and practices. You heard a little bit of this earlier from Iveta Silova. Our team set out to address the lack of research on climate and environmental change and education in two of the world's most heavily impacted countries by conducting a qualitative study of youth's daily educational and life experiences in fishing and agricultural communities in Ghana and Malawi. As part of this broader study, we collected textbook materials in the schools where we worked. Our goal was to examine how these materials conceptualize human-earth relations and climate change in order to understand how curricula might support or undermine education for sustainable development, global justice, and planetary health efforts at the scale of youth's daily lives. We utilized a range of team content analysis methods, which are outlined in the brown circle, which we'd be happy to talk about in greater detail during the Q&A.
Okay. So in this article, we situate our analysis in the field of political ecology, and we adopt Yorubidat's broad definition of political ecology as the study of intersecting political, economic, social, and ecological systems that are infused with considerations for both social and planetary justice. And so in response to a lot of the anthropocentrism, the individualism, and commodification that appears in dominant framings of the environment and environmental change, these approaches to political ecology conceive of human-earth relations as complex assemblages, as networked interactions, and species entanglements, which emphasize that human well-being cannot be meaningfully disentangled from non-human and non-living forces. So for us, a curriculum analysis is going to be an essential component of any political ecological study of education in Ghana and Malawi for at least two reasons. First, in both settings, these are centralized education systems that are organized around high stakes exams where the textbooks represent the official statement of what students should learn, right? So, and then secondly, the schools and the families with whom we work didn't generally have extensive additional written materials available for students. And so the textbooks became particularly important source of information. So in our analysis, we examined all the official materials that were available in the schools we worked across every major subject. And we began by examining, in our article, we begin by talking about the educational ecosystems in which the materials are developed. So we look at the colonial logics that persist post-independence in both countries, and also talk about the neo-colonial dependencies that are formed by the roles that international development funders play in curriculum development. And then we then examined the political structure of the curriculum and the textbooks that we were working with. And then we looked specifically at how grade 8 textbooks represent the three questions that you see on the slides. So really briefly, we thought part of why I wanted to do a PowerPoint so that you could actually see what the textbooks look like. So you see in Ghana, for example, how the detailed factual information and examination learning model is presented here with the types of questions and the amount of content. And in Malawi, we see more student-centered but sparse factual information and an emphasis on an experiential learning model that you see here.
Despite significant and quantifiable differences in the curriculum design, as you just saw, we were most struck by the onto-epistemological similarities in both countries' curricular materials. So our findings are organized around 3 analytic themes that represent these similarities. And we'll show you some examples from the textbooks of how these themes appear. The first theme that we identified was utilitarianism. Both curricula consistently represent the non-human world only in relation to its value for humans. To the extent that value can be extracted from these quote unquote resources, individuals should manage and improve them to develop their own and the country's wealth. Both curricula thus normalize the dominionist assumption that the Earth's commons exist for human use and manipulation, and that the value of the non-human, non-living lies only in their utility for human development efforts. This logic is quite evident in these examples related to cattle, fish, and trees in Malawi, which reduce these historically very important co-species to raw materials and income. Ghana's curriculum talks in a very similar manner about water bodies and minerals, as these 2 examples show.
So in our article, our second focus theme is the focus on the tensions between modernism and indigeneity. So both the Ghanaian and Malawian curriculum consistently present a message that a modern, educated, prosperous life means having to participate in more efficient and industrialized forms of production. So large-scale monocropping, livestock improvement. And the curricula exhort students to adopt modern and environmentally damaging technologies, right, such as using refrigerators and cars. The curriculum themselves note that these technologies are less environmentally sustainable, but they still argue that both are necessary for and reflective of what development looks like. So the emphasis on modernization, on technology use is directly juxtaposed with what is presumably unproductive, and here you see superstitious subsistence practices. So in this way, both curricula consistently denigrate tools and practices that people have developed over millennia to live with the earth and their fellow co-species. So for example, the example we're sharing here in this section of the Ghanaian social studies curriculum, in the bottom right, you see it presents a story of why the people of Zaire and Dulugu are forbidden from eating goat meat. And the story in the case study describes a goat restoring the sight of an old man. And the chief of these towns recognizes this act by declaring that no one can eat goat meat, no one can kill a goat. And this indigenous practice of respect and gratitude towards a co-species is framed as a damaging superstition. And superstition, according to the textbook in the sections above in orange, will prevent the growth of scientific development, will reduce people's abilities to solve problems for themselves, and leads to human rights abuses. Our third theme that we cover in the article focuses on hyper-individualization that is manifested, which manifests in 2 ways. First, it manifests as a responsibilization of individuals almost exclusively, right? The causes of and responsibility for addressing environmental change are deeply individualized in both the Ghanaian and Malawian textbooks. So learners are frequently tasked with changing their own behaviors to manage and conserve the commons like water and wood, so that they remain abundant and available for human use. In such accounts of hyper-individualization, we see also that state, corporate, international actors sort of largely disappear from explanations of climate and environmental change. Corporations and global actors are rarely discussed, and where they are, they're actually lauded for promoting development. So this slide is interesting because it shows the 2 contrasting sides of hyper-individualization quite clearly for us. On the left, small-scale farmers like Yakubu are presented as using inefficient techniques that cannot support their families or not able to contribute to national development, while large companies that use modern technologies, going back to that point, modern technologies like monocropping, machinery use, and chemicals are actually described as being able to support employment and provide social services, which in turn, develop the nation.
These examples point to how current curricula fail to address the complexity of the relationships and processes driving climate and environmental change. In particular, they place blame and responsibility on the individuals whose activities least contribute to climate and environmental change. And they disappear the national and international processes and actors that most contribute. As such, we conclude that curricula need to be developed with a more clear-eyed analysis of the global relations of power that are shaping both climate and environmental change and curricular development. Our hope would be that such a, honestly, radical shift in the curricula could lead to development of curricula that account for the 6 points listed here, and therefore better support youth well-being and thriving across the continent. I don't think I need to say much more clearly, but obviously such curricula would deeply challenge the current disappearance of very powerful actors in the national and international scale. So thank you very much for letting us provide a brief overview of the article. And now we will flip back to you, Radhika. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. And yeah, I think this is really powerful in terms of your narrative, in terms of understanding what is the relationship between humans, non-humans, animals, and how the books portray the use of animals and use of like a commodification of nature to suit human beings. And I think I clearly agree that we need to flip this methodology, flip this kind of teaching and learning to really discovering our place in nature. So thank you for making that very obvious through the textbooks analysis that you did. Seems like there was some discussion on transportation and some discussion on agriculture, health aspects as well. So again, maybe a very Western concept of systems thinking approach. Did you maybe see some insights on all these different sectors coming together, or did you think that maybe that was not even a discussion that the books included and it was just very factual?
Yes, to the latter. So in sort of teasing out how hyper-individualized the messaging of climate and environmental change, the messaging of what development looks like, the messaging of what supporting one's family and one's nation looks like, because of the zooming in on the individual and the disappearing of state actors, corporate actors, international actors, you are unable to sort of tease out what a systems thinking approach to any of these issues would look like, right? Because they are sort of disentangled in a lot of these analyses from the systems and the processes that could sort of more extensively discuss things like transportation and health, whether it's access to, causes, impacts from. So there's a lot of things that actually come out of sort of zooming in on the individual beyond what it means for responsibility and what it means for who is signaled as to blame as responsible, because you're not able to situate this in any systems thinking if you don't connect these to other kinds of actors and systems. Yeah.
And just to add to that briefly, Radhika, on the issue of kind of cross-sectoral thinking from a development perspective, in some ways that actually has to be restricted in the curriculum for it to make the points that it makes. So for example, the company in Ghana that is lauded for using chemicals, for using a lot of chemicals in monocrop production, there's a pretty significant health literature on the impacts that those kinds of chemicals are having on people's health, particularly in kind of local markets where people don't have a lot of ability to choose produce that hasn't been very heavily chemicalized, if you will. So you have to actually disconnect the health and the, for example, agricultural literatures in order to laud the development models that are lauded in both of these curricula.
Thank you, Nancy. You know, in the initial, when we had started this discussion in the morning, Lucia Rodriguez was asking whether bringing in this idea of sustainable development, and is it beneficial? Is it beneficial for whom? And is it agenda driven? Are we taking the local environmental education into context? And there's always this fine balance. We all know that we have to localize the SDGs, this, that. But from your study, it seems like sustainable development is not even a framework, but I also don't like the local framework that is being used, because where is the balance then? Because we are taking sustainable development lens globally, and obviously it's not working out. It doesn't have to be, it has to be localized. So that's not happening. But in your textbooks, the local version also doesn't seem to work out. So is there where is climate justice here? How do we transform these textbooks? Who is going to bring that education dialogue? I know these are all difficult questions, but I'm sure you must have thought of all these things after your paper was done or in your discussions. Just wanted to get your insights on that.
So, Radhika, I think that's a really, I want to take a little bit of a 90-degree angle on that question for a second, if I could, because one of the things that's really interesting about the curriculum is that both of the curricula are very nationalized. They're very clearly in Ghana and they're very clearly in Malawi, but they're actually not localized at all. So, for example, there's no real information for people who live and depend on fishing. There's no real information about fishing. There's no discussion about the oceans and lagoons and rivers in Ghana and how to think about development, sustainable development, livelihoods, adaptation, any of that in relation to those contexts. Nor is there space in the curriculum to let teachers and students explore that. So on the one hand, they're not actually localized in ways that support the learning goals that we have for the most part related to the SDGs. And on the other hand, they're not globalized in ways that let people think about their particular roles and situations vis-a-vis climate change and environmental degradation, which is both very local and very not local. And so I think one of the things that really struck us is that if we want formal schooling to start playing the roles we say we want it to play, we're going to have to think really carefully about how you support teachers and students in bringing their own lives and experiences into these conversations. And we're also going to have to think really carefully about why the curricula have so little discussion of the realities of global politics and what is actually driving climate and environmental change. Mark Maines asked, how intentional do you think this messaging is? I don't think you have to believe that there's people sitting there kind of clicking their fingers together, deciding to disappear global relations of power. But those people are controlling what goes into the curriculum, and they bring their particular biases and their particular fears and their particular interests to the table when they do that. And I'm going to shut up and ask Yaa if she wants to add anything.
I think somewhere in your question was this idea of local versus sort of more globalized sustainable development discourses. And we were talking as we were writing the paper and actually just recently about how or why sustainable development doesn't work, not just because of sort of the tensions between global and local, that in both of these countries, the development is the goal and the sustainable aspect of the development sometimes sits in opposition to that and is explained as such, right? So whether it's national development, especially in the Ghana curriculum, which is framed very extensively as we all need to come together and build Mother Ghana with all our various individual practices. And the Malawian curriculum that does some of that, but it's like, you need to do this to develop yourself and to keep the industries that provide jobs and support families running. All of that sits as, that is the main goal, right? We need to develop individuals, families, and the nation, even if it sits in opposition, and it says this explicitly in many sections, even if this sits opposition to various forms that might seem more sustainable or more ecologically sustainable, right? We need to look at economically sustainable mechanisms, which would be like creating jobs and sustaining industries, right? That's the sustainability that sits. Like we can't have, we can't have certain industries disappear and we have to promote certain industries. That's the development that is emphasized in a lot of these texts.
Fascinating, completely fascinating, and so much to think of here. I think Gregory is asking a question on books. What is the process? Where are the textbooks developed, and where is the geographical location where they are published?
So we did quite a bit of research that couldn't go into this paper, unfortunately, on the particular ways that the two curricula that we examined were developed. And the short version of it is that in both cases, Anglophone international development organizations like the United States Agency for International Development, the British aid organization DFID, the World Bank, played these central roles in funding the curricula. In Ghana, Ghanaian curriculum developers were more empowered to determine the shape and scope of the curriculum. In Malawi, they were less so. And so in both cases, the governments that we're talking about the curricula were deeply constrained by their financing on the part of international development actors. And that reliance on international development financing comes in part in both countries from the particular ways that structural adjustment policies were implemented, again, on the part of international development organizations, and also the particular way that education budgets work in the post-education for all era. So when governments really rapidly expanded education, they were promised international funding at the World Conference on Education for All, but that funding never appeared. And so the governments are generally highly dependent for all sorts of new curricular development, new teacher training approaches on international development funding. That plays a huge role in what they look like.
Yeah, you want to add something?
No, that's it. I don't know if Gregory had a specific question about publishing. I don't know. So the curriculum, so in Ghana, it's an interesting system where the curriculum development is highly nationalized, and then the publishing system is a very private system. So the National Accreditation Board for Curriculum and Assessment develops curriculum frameworks, develops teaching guides, sends them out to publishers, and private publishers develop textbooks that reflect the curriculum frameworks. And then they bid for which textbooks become like the government textbook that gets sent to schools. And then, other publishers are free to, put theirs in bookshops and libraries, but private publishers develop these materials that get taken up by the government, and then the government picks, several textbooks made by private publishers to develop the content. Yes, that's just what I meant.
Thank you for explaining the entire ecosystem with national movements to education settings to textbooks to where these are published and who publishes it and funding. And here I hear UNESCO saying we are creating this movement on transforming education, whereas this really requires rethinking of every part of what education system works, on how education system works, who are these key stakeholders, how are they developing things, and how is this whole ecosystem not supporting what needs to be supported for the environment. And then we are leaving a big gap. I think it's a big miss in terms of how we are educating our or not educating our children in the schools. So I think this is really something that is troubling to hear, and thanks for bringing all these topics up in your paper so that we can be more enlightened about the topic. Nancy mentioning World Bank and of course all these other players who are there trying to see how they can fund, and what they want to fund is obviously another discussion that really happens at the national level, and how local priorities are lost. Any other, we have about a minute, but any other question that is coming up from our audience? I think this paper will stay on with us for a very long time, and thanks for your presentation. Oh, Professor Bond has a question. Yes, sorry.
Yes, just very quick, and it may just have to resonate on the floor. In terms of like development narratives, are we telling ourselves a different narrative about how the global South should develop in terms of the global North? Do we expect Africa to develop differently than the way the Americas, perhaps? That's just a larger, more philosophical question in terms of, you know, equitable development.
If I know we're out of time, but if I could just say really quickly in response to that very thought-provoking question that needs about an hour. But I think that it is very important that people recognize that the two countries that we're talking about right now are in the midst of really serious pressures / disasters related to climate change and environmental degradation. Malawi has a cyclone coming down on it right now, which will be on top of a cholera epidemic caused in part by flooding over the last 2 years. And the maize is dying because the rains have been too hard after being too dry. So when we talk about development, I think we need to recognize that we are often glossing over the daily realities that people are wrestling with in making claims about development looking in a certain way or taking particular forms or needing particular efforts on the part of people at a national level as opposed to an international level. These are recent post-colonial states where the colonial powers are still deeply imbricated in shaping things like the curriculum and deeply imbricated in the removal of resources from the country as we speak. And so I do think that the notion of national development needs to be very deeply questioned when we talk about the processes that are playing out in countries like Malawi and Ghana, from the curriculum construction process all the way through to the notions of who's responsible for who surviving and thriving and being part of the global community in discussions. The UNESCO Education for Sustainable Development framework, I would encourage you all to read it from the perspective of what you might imagine would be a child in Ghana or Malawi. ESD assumes a very particular kind of learner in a very particular kind of government system with very particular forms of power. And it's very, I think, deeply problematic to think that that's a good model for everyone, or perhaps to think that it's a good model for anyone, given how bad we are at understanding the situations that people around the world are living in right now. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Nancy. And yeah, I think we need to be critical, and I think you have stated it to the, and your paper shows it, and you have mentioned it many times. I think this is a clear message that we really need to be critical about our approaches, about global movements, what harm they are doing, what good they are doing, and really be a conscious researcher or a conscious practitioner while we continue with our work. So thank you so much for sharing those critical perspectives and shaping our thinking of how we should be going ahead with these bigger challenges. Environment is a bigger challenge, but really our thinking needs to reflect and be cognizant of all the factors that are affecting this particular movement. Thank you so much for spending your time and sharing your paper with us. It's really been a pleasure.